Welcome to the House Rules, the gaming compliance podcast from the Association of Certified Gaming Compliance Specialists. In this podcast, we will hear from casino and iGaming compliance specialists, discussing the latest trends and hot topics impacting the industry. We will also be focusing on careers in compliance, hearing from seasoned professionals about their own career paths and sharing their expertise and insights. In this episode, join Kevin deBruyckere, Director, AML and Investigations at the British Columbia Lottery Corporation, BCLC, and Cary Skrine, Executive Director, Enforcement at the Gaming Policy and Enforcement Branch, British Columbia, for an exploration on how regulators and the regulated sector can work together effectively.
Great. Thanks very much. Just a little, background or a little kind of preview of how we're going to do this. So I'll start. Kevin deBruyckere. I'm Director of AML and Investigations at British Columbia Lottery Corporation, as mentioned by Ian. I've been with BCLC for just over 3 years. Prior to that, I was with HSBC for 4, and with the RCMP for a period of time before that. Maybe I'll just have Cary do a little intro.
Sure, and I think it's good afternoon for everybody. My name is Cary Skrine. I'm the Executive Director for the Enforcement Division for the Gaming Policy Enforcement Branch. I smiled because Kev just said RCMP for a period of time. We were both in the RCMP, but I used to tease out the fact that he had a lot more service and was more senior than I. So I guess he's no longer sharing the number of years. I was in the RCMP for 26 years in the British Columbia area. Finished out in gangs and organized crime in the interior here, and then been with GPEB since 2016. And for this, specific to this presentation, in 2018 was asked in response to Dr. German's Dirty Money report to start to realign our regulatory framework with more of an enforcement purview. And so I helped form the division, and then ultimately have been working with Kevin and others in the industry to establish our AML footprint as a regulator, which was a bit nebulous prior to this period of time. So back to you, Kev.
Great. Maybe the outline, I think we just went over that.
Yeah, forgot
I was in control. There we go. So I'm just going to start off with a little bit of background terminology, landscape, communication, collaboration, how we, as a regulated entity, work with our provincial regulator, some of the enforcement areas, and some of the risk principles of risk management and risk mitigation that we're able to accomplish. So again, to level set, for everybody on the call, gambling is a crime. It is a criminal offense in Canada, with a number of exceptions. Essentially, it is unless it is conducted and managed by the government of a province. British Columbia Lottery Corporation, in the case of BC, was established in 1985 as the Crown Corporation, responsible to conduct and manage gambling on behalf of the government of British Columbia. Ontario has a similar Crown Corporation, Ontario Lottery and Gaming. You have Manitoba has Manitoba Liquor and Lottery. So you have a number of these entities that under the respective provincial legislation, in the case of BC, the Gaming Control Act, assigns legislative that responsibility for conduct and management to the Crown Corporation. Now, that term is important because the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering Terrorist Financing Act, or FINTRAC, applies to the government of a province, and that includes both land-based and online casinos. Essentially, FINTRAC requires the entity responsible to conduct and manage to fulfill those requirements under the Act. BCLC, I'll use OLG as a comparator, contracts with service providers or or operators to operate the casinos. Examples of that would be Great Canadian Casinos, which are both in BC and Ontario, as well as Gateway is another, both are privately held companies now. Despite the service providers fulfilling a number of requirements on our behalf, for example, large cash transaction reporting, the Crown Corporation remains the entity accountable for ensuring the obligations are met. Again, just a little preview of, Ontario. I think this was during the pandemic. Despite the closures, we were able to still achieve $421 million over to the province, and that's specifically, for the most part, attributed to the growth of our own online offering, playnow.com. I have a chance to kind of explain the difference between Ontario and some of the other provinces. Ontario has chosen to go to a registration model through the formation of iGo or iGaming Ontario to register operators to operate their online sports betting and casinos within the province of Ontario. That's the little bit of a difference there. So what we do as a reporting entity, and this comes up quite often in terms of how we establish that suspicion versus reasonable grounds to suspect. This diagram is actually from the FinTrack website itself to help reporting entities establish that threshold for reporting suspicious transaction reports. So if you move left to right, and those who may have been formerly in the banking sector will perhaps understand that the parallels are a little bit too. So on the left, you have that simple suspicion where a employee, or in our case, a casino worker, establishes that there's something anomalous with a transaction or with activity that they're observing. They have a hunch, or there's an intuition based on their experience. They may not necessarily be able to fully articulate what that suspicion is, but they believe that there's something wrong. They then escalate that concern, in our case, in the form of a unusual financial transaction report. In the case of a banking sector, that could be an unusual activity report or something similar. That escalates that concern to the AML team or group of AML investigators, who then take a look at the facts, the context of the transaction, and apply that against the common money laundering indicators. Based on that review, that AML investigator taking a look at the transaction holistically, then may establish that there's reasonable grounds to suspect that transaction or series of transactions is related to potential money laundering or terrorist financing. That then results in a completion of a suspicious transaction report that is then submitted to FinTrack. That then is then picked up, in our case, by our provincial regulator, Cary's team. It's reported to FinTrack, who then have a team that do review all casino sector submissions. And in our case, which is something I think unique, every one of our STRs also goes to law enforcement, which is, like I say, I think it's unique. I think we're the only reporting entity to do that within Canada. That speaks to the relationship that we have and leveraging the authorities that we have under the Act and the Criminal Code to do that.
And before I move on from this slide, I'm going to touch on reporting a little bit more to us as the regulator. But if you have followed Dr. German's review, or most recently the Cullen Commission and testimony at the Commission, then you'll have heard kind of negative points of view and thoughts as to how we've communicated with BCLC, how BCLC has communicated with us, how we interact with the service providers. And I tell you that this slide, which you can see, there's a lot of subjectivity in each of these decision points, but we communicate and collaborate a lot throughout this. So the UFTs come to us. We're having ongoing discussions with Kevin and his team around the reasonable grounds and reasons to suspect. And so I would say because we're communicating a lot in this sphere and there's lots of eyes on the information that comes forward, we're making a lot more informed decisions on what should be investigated, what should be reported, these sorts of things. And we're in alignment. So just again, slide here just touches on the way our regulators set up in British Columbia. There are a number of divisions: compliance, which is their audit and horse racing division; enforcement, which I said started up in 2018, is investigations and intelligence. Now that previously sat under the compliance framework, so it's not that we didn't have investigations or intelligence, but we've just placed a greater focus on it from an enforcement perspective. We have our licensing, registration, and certification division, which both deals with both the entities and the people involved in gambling. Our community supports division, which is now Gambling Supports BC, which provides the responsible gaming and a lot of the mental health and addiction support in that area. Strategic Policy and Projects division, which over the last couple of years has been heavily involved in supporting the ledge writing, as we are moving to a full Gaming Control Act amendment, which is supposed to be before Cabinet at the end of this year. And then we'll be transitioning to the Independent Gambling Control Office. So we'll be moving to an independent agency similar to the investigative office, or the IIO, which is Independent Investigations Office that does investigations in policing. We will be set up similarly in a legislative setting where there's a level of independence from government. And then there's our operations division, which captures our finances, HR, and other matters. So, but I want to key on some of the things that we've spent spent a lot of time focusing on since 2019, is establishing a more proactive real-time response to transactions linked to money laundering in the casinos. So prior to that, all of our work was in after-action reporting and after-action investigation. So we're becoming more engaged at the front end and the frontline response. That also includes a real-time response to criminal behavior in the casinos and implementation of a collaborative intelligence model, so which is now referred to as the Gaming Intelligence Investigative Unit, which I'll be touching on. But really, what we've been keyed on is trying to be redefine our purpose within the regulatory framework. And like I said earlier, establishing what our money laundering responsibility is. Dr. German's report, which was a recommendation, which was accepted by government, is that GPEB as a regulator take on the responsibility for AML. But what that looks like, how that's legislated, and how we fit in the regulatory scheme alongside FinTrack there's been a lot of work there. But we're establishing a foothold that didn't previously exist for us as the regulator. Our reporting expectations are established under Section 86 of the Gaming Control Act. I'm sure it's similar to legislation out there. The general manager establishes items that we wish reported to us that would be deemed or consider a potential threat to integrity of gaming. In the area, again, of money laundering and proceeds of crime, we've established further details to help service providers in BCLC in requesting that unusual financial transactions are reported to us, suspicious large cash transactions, and or suspicious patron gaming fund account activities reported to us, suspicious electronic fund transfers, suspicious financial transactions, and unsourced funds, including third-party bank drafts. So this gives a general context of what we would be expected, what we'd expect to be reported to us. And then ultimately it kind of sets a framework for this collaborative sphere that we work with Kevin's team and his AML Investigations unit on. Over the last 2 years, we've really spent considerable time in upping our game in our collaboration. We've formed several different groups, which I'll touch on here. Kevin's got his fingerprints on a number of these as well. And in each area, it's with the goal of ensuring a more effective, timely response to what I would suggest is going to be, an ever-changing landscape of criminal threat, money laundering threat. My experience is that you shut one door and they try to pry open another crack. So we want to be nimble in our approach and in our collaborative response with gaming service providers, BCLC, law enforcement, make sure that we are working off the same sheet of music. So the first area is a casino response collaborative. We set this up a couple years ago. We set it up as a steering committee to really establish what our role and responsibility is in a more proactive response, but then moved it to a collaborative. We've had a couple meetings now. So we have the police of jurisdiction in the area of our 5 major casinos. I think I should touch on that, unlike Ontario, we as the regulator have enforcement responsibilities for the Act. So we don't have the police engaged directly within our network. So we do that through collaboration with the service or with the police jurisdiction in the areas, which is Vancouver City Police, New West City Police, the RCMP in several areas. And then we do have our GPEB connection, which I'll touch on. But we meet basically quarterly to just discuss how we've responded to calls, what current trends or risks are showing up. Kevin and I both take an opportunity to educate our police partners on different trends that we're seeing or activities that are occurring on the casinos that should be brought to the attention of the police, and then ultimately work towards ensuring that the right organization at the right mandated level is responding to whatever incident we are facing, or if not responding independently, responding collaboratively. The Gaming Intelligence Investigative Unit, which I touched on, is a unit that you'll see is absent of BCLC. And this is where we as the regulator and GPEB, and the JIGIT, which is the Joint Illegal Gaming Investigative Team, have formed an intelligence unit. And inside that unit, again, that's new as of 2019, we've established a framework where both intelligence from the gaming sector as well as police intelligence, when appropriate to share for a law enforcement purpose, are melded together, and there's deeper dives done to actually formulate actionable intelligence products that either the police or us as the regulator can act upon. And so we are working very hard to become intelligence-led, and through that body of work, which is they're really becoming our kind of intelligence and information network. They are doing risk assessments in the various areas that we receive information, and then churning out reports relative to our assessment of risk on highest priorities that we want to pay attention to, focus on. And I'll touch on that a little bit later. Another, I would say, pillar for our collaboration is the Gaming Integrity Group. And this group meets weekly. This is GPEB, BCLC, and JIGIT, the police components to JIGIT. And in that form, we discuss high-risk patrons, high-risk trends, and again, ensure that by information sharing, intelligence sharing, that the appropriate agency is responding to whatever incident we're facing. And tied into this is some patron interviewing protocols we established here, where we established whether it's most appropriate for the police to follow up and conduct an interview relative to an incident, or us as a regulator, or if BCLC through their KYC efforts continues to move forward. But whoever does the interview, ultimately there's an information sharing protocol in place around those interviews to make sure that each entity is armed with the information they should be armed with. The AML Risk Management Committee, we have put this through a bit of an overhaul as of late, but it ultimately is a committee currently involving management with BCLC and management with GPEB. And the goal is to, based on the various groups that we have operating and or, with our network, to audit on both sides of the house, that we take in information on potential new risks, new vulnerabilities, items that are surfacing in both sides, both agencies, that we then can discuss at a management level to determine what the best response is. And specifically, we're focusing on what the policy response may be. So whether it's a BCLC policy that will resolve the issue in their responsibilities to report to FINTRAC, whether it's a general manager regulation that may be required to say firm up a direction that we're asking all the service providers and all entities responsible under a regulatory act to respond to, whether there's legislative changes that are required. This group will ultimately put their fingerprints and decide on what the level of risk is, whether any research is required, and ultimately what our collective response should be. And the last group I'll touch on that isn't led by either of us, but we're both principal partners on, and I'm sure many on the call have heard of it, is the Counter Illicit Finance Alliance of British Columbia. Now there is a just lost it. Let's see if I just lost it.
Yeah, they are looking at a national, is that where you're getting at?
No, I just think just the name. I just lost it.
Oh, Counter Illicit Finance Alliance.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
There's a national model. Sorry about that. Got a little mind blank. There is a national model, but really BC is the first province to really take this off and run with it. And it's forming a bit of a pilot for what may form in other provinces, but I know there's a plan to try to form in each province, led by the RCMP. And it is our private and public partnership that's being established here. That right now, GPEB, BCLC, financial institutions, FINTRAC, and other professional institutions participate in. And we're sharing information on a strategic level right now. Certainly, there are doors open through the networking to share directly on a more tactical level between organizations. I think this has been a very proactive step for us in the province, and there's current work right now on establishing a regional prioritization model that will fit and be informed by the national prioritization model that will even help further in this group and this network, taking away the threat landscape and knowledge and understanding of the changes in the threat landscape, and then employing proper mitigation strategies relative to each of our mandates. That's really the goal, so that everybody's better informed, we're better communicating, and we're better responding in our collective areas to harden as a province against money laundering.
Yeah, maybe a good example. Maybe I'll just speak quickly to an example here. So Project Athena, which is initiative, public-private partnership that resulted in an operational alert being published by FINTRAC around underground banking, bank draft activity. I can't remember all the issues. So as BCLC in our casinos began to reduce the amount of cash that could come in, specifically requiring cash to be sourced back to the player, through a receipt or something like that. That resulted in an increase in bank drafts being presented. Then through this work, vulnerabilities were identified with respect to bank drafts. Now, we don't have line of sight on that. The banks would have line of sight on how accounts from which bank drafts were purchased were funded. That then led to an initiative led by, the predecessor to CIFA BC, to have financial institutions include purchaser information on the face of a bank draft, and then allowing that control or that loophole or knock down that mole again through our kind of whack-a-mole process. So I think that's a good example of some of the things we're looking at with respect to CIFA BC. Whenever you apply a control, that mole will kind of pop up somewhere else, whether it's another methodology or another even geography.
Yeah, well, that's great, Kevin. And I think the other thing to highlight here, I mean, currently each of these groups are set up with with strong consideration of both federal and provincial privacy law, and both the limitations of our ability to share and the opportunities, I would say. So, that's why I point out that, for instance, in the Gaming Intelligence Investigative Unit, it's strategically decided BCLC would not necessarily be at that table, because at that table we want to be sharing for a law enforcement purpose, discussing information at that law enforcement level, and producing products in an open fashion, that because we have special provincial constable appointments, we have that latitude and capability to share, but then we also can filter out and vet the information that needs to come from that group out to BCLC with our relationship as a regulated. So I would also touch on, the one thing that came out of Cullen that I'm looking forward to seeing if it gets traction is whether they form some sort of financial intelligent investigative unit in this province, and whether there's some guiding legislation that would help further open the door to real-time tactical information sharing. I think there's a huge gap, and I understand there's a few from the U.S. on the call, but we are ultimately manipulated by those criminal elements out there that are trying to earn big money, but by those areas where it's difficult for us to share in real time, whether that be private or public, and we get taken advantage of, in my view, in this country because of it. So look forward to see if there's opportunities that flow from any new legislation. Just a few more details on both the GIIU and the GIG. So I touched on how things are reported to us. Ultimately, we have information coming into the GIIU from BCLC, from gaming service providers directly through 86 reporting, through CFSU. So the Joint Illegal Gaming Investigative Team provides information, shares information. There's a whole human source intelligence cultivation area that the police bring under the CFSU model that will share and provide information into this model. And it's through a risk assessment that files are deemed to be low risk, medium, or high risk. So if we do identify something as low risk, that will start an intelligence file on that particular individual or group, and it'll just sit as an information gathering database. And if anything is deemed to be medium or high risk based on the risk assessment matrix we have in place, then an actual intelligence report is produced. And it's through these latter two areas that either our investigative team, our casino deployment teams, or our investigative components within the Gaming Intelligence Investigative Unit will be informed to follow up and conduct investigations. And in most cases, that will include interviewing patrons. It may include surveillance of some levels inside or outside of the casino to try to establish who is networked and any particular nefarious activity that may be going on. And then through all of this work, where appropriate, there's opportunities for referrals to law enforcement. We've referred to CRA, civil forfeiture, or JIGIT, who's responsible for, I would say, mid-range or crime type investigations within a gaming context. It may be referred to them for further project work. The GIG, again, which I referred to, and I really see again as our cornerstone, similar information is brought in. We have UFTs and STR information, and much of obviously the information in the STRs filed by BCLC will include information from the UFTs. The BCLC, in my view, Kevin's AML team has a very robust risk assessment process they do on patrons, and bring forward all information on patrons they deem to be high risk. Our Section 86 reporting, and then our casino response reports, which I don't think I elaborated on this. We have a 7-day coverage, 14 hours a day coverage within the casinos. And our investigators now conduct shift work within the 5 major casinos in the Lower Mainland. So it's from that team that we get after action reports continually brought forward that become part of the information that's piped into the GIG. So like I said, we meet weekly. We'll have discussions on various informations, and each agency really has a responsibility to vet the information they have access to, assess the risk associated to that information, and bring the information forward. Then in these collaborative discussions, we're finding the BCLC in their implementation of cash conditions, that's become more robust. BCLC will seek out and obtain risk assessments that will add to their provincial borrowings. We as the regulator can do borrowings as well. It'll also inform ongoing and future regulatory investigations. And then we also share information out of this group for criminal investigation. So all of that, the collaboration, the groups, these various areas where we really dig into the information that's available to us, has led, in our point of view, to an enhanced AML regime. It's put us in a much better place to prevent loan sharking and money laundering and the use of proceeds of crime. Really, we've expanded our horizons from just these kind of narrow visions to financial crime in general, which Kevin aptly points out. Much of what we look at now doesn't have a direct tie to necessarily money laundering, but it may be fraud. There may be other financial criminal elements attached to it, and we want to harden the industry against those threats. We are much better at prioritizing and deconflicting on what each organization is responsible for, and maximizing our finite resources across each of our organizations. Kev, I think this is yours.
Right, including East European organized crime, selling fake jewelry to
exactly.
BCLC casino patrons. So, to wrap up, so, I think, those that have any interest, certainly dive into the 500 and some odd pages. Cullen, describing the casino sector here in BC that gave rise to a number of findings. And I don't know if everybody on the call knows what that is, but BC just wrapped up a commission of inquiry into money laundering in BC that started with reports into the casino sector, specifically the amount of cash in the form of $20 bills packaged in such a way as to leave little doubt that it was proceeds of drug trafficking. Those with law enforcement backgrounds on the call, I'm sure you know what I mean. Quickly though, that expanded into a review into other sectors of the economy, real estate, luxury goods, to highlight that it's a much broader issue than this casinos, which happened to be closed for a year and a half due to COVID. Yet drug trafficking and fentanyl overdoses continued. So I think that's, if anybody is interested in kind of looking what's there, cullencommission.ca has the final report there. So if you look at kind of that framework in terms of those risks, and this is just a good example of how we're constantly striving to apply controls to new risks as they come to light, and then managing that residual risk, having this ongoing dialogue to ensure that whatever risk is left over is acceptable. One thing with dealing with government entities, that's always a challenging discussion, because generally governments are apprehensive of having to accept any risk. But that's something that we're constantly working on. Like for example, some of the mitigations, the interview program, the receipting requirements for all cash transactions. We actually implemented recently a regulatory amendment requiring identification for every single transaction or buy-in of $3,000 or more. That's on top of the requirement to obtain information at $10,000 cash that then forms a report to FINTRAC. So you can see where this is going in terms of the acceptance of cash within the industry. In fact, that was one of Colin's recommendations, is to start a process to move towards account-based or carded play. Sounds easy, but there's a lot of complexities that go with having to implement something like that. And I think that's about all we have. Ian, do you have any questions or?
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Cary. We actually have two questions in the chat. Maybe the first one is directed at Cary. Actually, it's regarding information sharing. And you showed a slide earlier on that was full of acronyms and abbreviations, and a lot of different groups with different stakeholders, both from the public and the private sector. In the BC landscape, with so many different groups, so many different actors, is there any occasions where there's duplication of effort or white space?
Yeah, I mean, I so first, apologies for the acronyms. If there's any specific acronyms you want explained, I can lay them out. But I think we're very much working to avoid that. But I would say right now, there's no doubt there's probably still overlap in some areas and areas of redundancy. Ultimately, the goal is with the various stakeholders, from the work that the gaming service providers do to what BCLC does, us, the police. The goal is with our ability to share information and the legislative, say, limitations to sharing information depending on who's talking to who. The goal is to be as efficient, as effective as possible, and I think we are working towards that.
I think the Crown model, this Crown Corporation model, that does have a certain advantage insofar as BCLC, OLG, we're a public body under the provincial privacy legislation, and that allows us to share information with law enforcement at our discretion. So there are some advantages that come with that, as opposed to, say, that CIFA BC model on the far right, where financial institutions are private entities, professional associations, like the law societies, for example, are limited in terms of the specific tactical information that they can share. So I think that's one of the advantages of the model that we have here in Canada.
That's great. Thanks, Kevin. Cary. The second question that we have relates to both residual risks and also the broader environment, where we've had the German report, we've now had the Cullen Commission. What's next? That's the question.
I'll go first with it. I guess, and again, if you haven't read the Cullen Commission report in detail, I'm sure you haven't because it's 1,800 pages, then there you may have more kind of blind spots as to what's next out here. In my view, we are trending in the right direction, and I think Cullen spoke to that. Both Kevin and I had the opportunity to testify, and basically, I guess from that assessment point of view, looking at all industry and all sectors what could be impacted by money laundering, I think we came out with only 4 recommendations, and really an endorsement that the work that we're doing in collaborating and sharing, and where the lines are drawn between what is the responsibility of BCLC as the regulated and us as a regulator, and how we kind of dovetail and or parallel FinTrack regulation, that all in all, our industry's in good shape, and Kevin touched on it. And I think the tricky bits is to get the politicians above my head to recognize that no matter what in this particular industry, there is going to be risk. It's just making sure that we're paying attention to the right areas and mitigating our highest risks, and that we all get to a level of acceptance of the residual risk that exists.
And just 100%, and jumping on on that, I think we need to look at it, continue to look at it broadly. Like, for example, as BC began to take action with respect to cash facilitation, started to ban players. Well, guess who shows up in Ontario? A number of these players not only show up in Ontario, but they show up in underground casinos in Ontario. The large one in Markham, for example, is a good example where, players from BC that we take action up on. So I think there's work to do with respect to that national sharing of information that would help facilitate some action taken in those other jurisdictions. I think the other other challenge is that we are driving the activity underground. So there are underground casinos throughout British Columbia, throughout Toronto, that these players that are there playing with proceeds of crime, getting access to cash. Chinese nationals who do come here can't get the, even though they're wealthy, cannot get access to their hands on cash unless they engage an underground MSB. So it really kind of highlights a need for law enforcement to keep on top of that and potentially take action as necessary. I think where we're heading, that's a good question. I think, where we're heading. So last year, Canada chose to legalize single event sports betting. That is the ability to bet on a single game as opposed to a group of games or events. That really, I think, opened our eyes in terms of how popular that activity is and how many of these sites operate, that sports betting as a way to get into their online casinos. So, where that takes us, potential corruption, match fixing, opportunities for money laundering. You look at, things like esports. Look at some of the enforcement action taken in Europe, the mafia in Italy, and law enforcement efforts there. The soccer match fixing has been, really prevalent. So this is kind of, I think, what we're on the leading cusp of starting to see here in Canada. We have cryptocurrency casinos that are operating, without any controls. Drake is a good example in his association to a site called stake.com. He'll go on Twitch TV online and live stream as he's playing on that site. So I think it's just, not only from a money laundering, from a corruption, match fixing perspective, I think where we're heading towards is a greater awareness of the harms caused by some of this activity, and player health and responsible gaming. I think we're just kind of, I got a bad feeling on it, actually. So I think it's something we have to be really alive to.
Yeah. And I just want to add, echoing Kev, I think there's been a lot of adjusted focus right now from a regulatory perspective on the player health impacts to some of the trends we're seeing in specifically online gaming and single event sports gaming. But I also too want to just add one more piece. We don't know at this stage what recommendations that's come out of the Cullen Commission report will actually truly get traction with government and what will be initiated. And so, I alluded to it earlier, but from my perspective, in a lot of work that I was able to engage in to get to this point, we can only do so much industry-wise, and then you go back, provincially, the province can only do so much provincially because we're dealing with a national and transnational issue. And, so I like the fact that there's been a recommendation to look at a financial investigation and intelligence unit in the province that deals with all sectors that may be threatened by this activity, because the legislation that could come with that would also open the door to this information sharing and bridging the gaps in information sharing that we see, which I touched on, because similar to FinTrack legislation, other legislation, as soon as legislation speaks to information sharing, wherever those opportunities are addressed within that legislation, they supersede provincial and federal privacy law. And so, there may be a framework that put in place that would appropriately people's privacy interests and the state interests to, share information at a greater pace and timing, or more appropriate timing. But then all of that too, again, you see the influences. If you read Cullen, you'll see the influences in him pushing for more from the federal perspective, because all of this aside, each of our provinces can only do so much without the Fed stepping up. And maybe this is where the blip, this is only Cary Skrine's opinion based on my experience, but they really hold the cards in establishing the proper level of framework that each of the provinces can operate within in an AML setting. And so I'm very interested to see what influence, because it was a provincial inquiry and he was careful to make sure that he didn't overstep, in my view, things that were a federal mandate. But he definitely gave enough nudges there that it'll be interesting to see how the feds respond.
Thanks, Cary. It looks as if the topic of information sharing is a popular one, because we do have another question on the information sharing piece, specifically related to high-risk patrons and information sharing between service providers, the Crown, corporations, and regulators. Could you describe how the level of information sharing is in BC, and if there's any best practices or improvements that you would suggest?
Kev, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, so I think we have a ongoing risk assessment done of patrons based on previous reporting, transaction level. We'll do our analysis of those individual patrons, check open sources, adverse media. If it's necessary, we'll do an STR if there's any information that puts past transactions into a new context, or a suspicion, that requires us to then file with FinTrack. That filing will then go into to GPEB and to the police to then allow, who allow for even more analysis to be undertaken using or accessing information that we would not have access to. So that's kind of that continuum that we would go through, not only through ongoing 6-month periodic reviews, but we also do ongoing adverse media monitoring as well, that would generate alerts against our database of players. And I think anything that gives rise to a requirement to report then would trigger Cary's team or law enforcement to then take action.
Yeah, and on our end of things, obviously, we gather all that information and receive that information under the Gaming Control Act and the requirements to report. I think if I follow the question correctly, then once we have it, then we have the responsibility to decide when appropriate to share with law enforcement, and we do maintain that firewall, even in a collaborative model like the Gaming Intelligence Investigative Unit, which has both police analysts and gaming analysts and police investigators and regulatory investigators. We maintain that firewall in our policies and procedures around when information shared, when databases are ultimately accessed to produce intelligence products, and then ultimately what comes out of that intelligence framework, and what's vetted when it's shared back, and what's maintained. I mean, there's lots of checks and balances, in my view, in place to ensure that we're on side with both federal and provincial privacy law. And so, yeah, we have a memorandum of understanding with the RCMP in this province that we also use and rely upon for sharing of information with the police and for the police to share with us. But when you dig right into it, my point of view, both federal and provincial privacy law give the opportunities for us to share, regardless of whether an MOU is in place or not. And it's just a matter of identifying the sections and kind of where the thresholds are that then open the door to sharing. So.
That's great. Thanks, Cary. It looks as if we have a supplementary question on this topic. So when we're looking at the relationship between the regulator, and law enforcement, could you describe and maybe this is not suitable for a public forum, but in terms of volume of referrals that move from the regulated to the regulator to law enforcement, how many referrals from the Crown Corporation reach law enforcement?
I'm assuming, are you just talking about the AML framework? I mean,
Yes.
I mean, reportable issue. We get about 10,000 reports a year, and I think one of the tricks that I'm going through right now is trying to kind of weed out what is the noise versus what is the areas that we really need to pay attention to. And we've got a risk assessment model and all sorts of stuff I won't get into to try to dig into that. I mean, obviously that is not all related specifically to financial crime threats. Ballpark probably a third of those would be financial crime related, but even then, a lot of what's being reported to us ultimately when we assess it, it actually doesn't even support us digging into an investigation or opening a file versus taking it forward and referring. So our referrals, at this stage are quite low. I mean, it's hard to parse out what would be deemed a referral versus what just out of our information sharing groups the police decide to pay attention to that wouldn't have paid attention to previously. I don't think I can give you an exact number, but I would say, we're not, I mean, if you're operating on the premise that it's a wild west for money laundering in this province, the answer is no, it's not. Certainly, things weren't being handled as well as they could be, but I would say, we're currently in a position where we're getting better and better at ensuring that proceeds of crime doesn't enter the casinos. Again, at the level of risk that I think we can manage with our resources. I don't know if that answers that at all. That's Kevin. I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah. So we meet weekly to review incidents. I think for the most part it ends up with the regulator, unless it fits within something the police are already looking at.
Yeah, like, I mean, that we try, I mean, and it's not it's kind of a blurry line, but what JIGIT's responsible for is illegal gaming in the province, and obviously we have responsibility for the legalized side of gaming, but any nefarious or illegal activity that exist in it, and there's crossover there. So, but certainly, when it comes to our collaboration with JIGIT, they're pretty much full on with either larger project work that they're already paying attention to that either links or doesn't link to the casinos, depending on the case, and they deal with illegal gaming reports, and we definitely saw an increase in that through COVID. But even in that area, unfortunately, we haven't had a great deal of success with prosecutions, and they continue to work out areas where investigations can improve or the evidence packages can improve, so Crown would move forward. But the public interest, at least in their assessment, doesn't seem to marry up with our assessment of public interest on those files. But we're also then responding as a regulator in that sphere to try to at least shut down the low-hanging fruit in the areas that maybe it's just individuals not aware of their licensing requirements, these sorts of things. So
I think we have our final question of the session, which is actually a follow-up to the discussion on identified high-risk patrons. The question goes, is there an established regulatory expectation for service providers to closely track and monitor the activities of identified high-risk patrons in their respected properties?
So there's nothing that I can think of in our regulation specifically puts focus on that. I would say Kevin's shop does that's their primary area where they identify high-risk patrons and then ultimately establish what would be expected by the entities, by the gaming service providers in response to those high-risk patrons. So we ultimately do receive reports, and and much of the many of the high-risk patrons are on our radar because of their financial transactions in areas that we would expect to be reported to us, but not specifically around the high-risk patron. If I follow the question correctly, I think that fits more with Kevin's.
Yeah. So what we would do, we have a system that a casino reporting system that links all of our 30-some casinos that we have visibility over. The service providers or the casino operators would only have visibility, for their sites. But as we go through this process of assessing or reviewing those that are deemed a higher risk, we may apply conditions to their play. We may, for example, require those players to provide a source for any of their buy-ins, regardless of amount. Now, that becomes detectable upon that individual reaching a certain threshold, or is otherwise known to the security staff at the property. If they are deemed to be trying to circumvent that threshold or those types of that area, then they could be subject to escalating sanctions right up to a maximum 5-year ban, and that would be a province-wide ban. So we rely on, and service providers or the operators take a lot of pride on their ability to detect any of that unusual activity through their surveillance capabilities at the properties.
That's great. Thanks very much. It doesn't look as if we have any more questions, and we are coming up to the top of the hour. So I'd just like to, on behalf of the ACGCS, thank Kevin and Cary for their time this morning. Over the past hour, we have covered quite a number of topics, and it would be remiss if we didn't flag up that over the next few weeks and months, we will be covering a number of these topics in subsequent webinars. We have shortly to be scheduled a presentation from Ontario, Canada. So that should serve as a nice contrast to British Columbia. And we'll also have webinars from further afield. We have regulators and regulated from Cyprus, Malta, and the United Kingdom presenting on their respective jurisdictions over the coming weeks. We'll also have a webinar on crypto casinos, which is something that Kevin touched upon earlier, and is certainly something that we're seeing as an emerging space, not just in Canada. And we will also have a session on sports betting and integrity as well, which is, as Kevin commented, an emerging space here in Canada also. So on that note, doesn't look as if there's any more questions, but just to thank Cary and Kevin one more time, and we'll end the call.
Thanks for having us, Ian.
Thanks very much.